السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. All praise belongs to Allah. And may the peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The messenger, the last and the final of the messengers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to the entirety of mankind to guide them as to how to live their lives on this earth. It was in June of this year, just a couple of months ago, that we first heard of the most recent clashes and violence and attacks on Muslims in Myanmar or Burma. And after 8 successive weeks, 2 months of continued sustained violence and attacks, burning and looting and killing, the situation now, as you've seen in the reports and the pictures, is indeed dire. Over 2,000 Muslims have been killed and close to 100,000 have been displaced. And of course, these are things which we have heard of in other places as well. But to understand how this is so much worse, we have to go a bit deeper. You saw some of the pictures coming out of these Muslims going in these leaky boats and being turned back. Now the difference in this situation is not just that people are being killed or that people are being displaced. We've seen that in many countries. The difference here is that these people have nothing. They have no one to back them. In the country in which they live, they are considered foreigners. Myanmar does not recognize them. When they go to Bangladesh, they are sent back. So the hell from which they try to escape, they are merely sent back by those who they seek to have some refuge with. Of course, we've seen, along with this, the deafening silence of the so-called international community. This non-existent concept of the international community, we've seen the silence. We've seen their reaction as if nothing is happening. We've seen also the silence of the media. We've seen the silence of the Muslim rulers and the way in which, number one, the surrounding countries have dealt with the issue. For the likes of Bangladesh and others, it's simply a policy question. It's a question of policy. We don't want to deal with them. It's a problem. We've already got enough. There's no Islam, there's no morality, there's not even any humanity. It's just policy, economics. And of course the other Muslim countries who have a responsibility, the Arab countries, Pakistan, others, they don't care. And of course we know we don't expect them to care, the regimes, the governments I'm talking about, because they have long lost any sense of Islam, any sense of morality on these issues. In the end, what we recognize is that the Rohingya Muslims of Myanmar are one of the most oppressed in the world. They're one of the most oppressed Muslim communities and one of the most oppressed communities in absolute terms in the world. Imagine, because we've seen other conflicts and we've seen other ways in which the oppressor has dealt with the issue. But have you ever seen this? Imagine the audacity of the president of Myanmar, Thein Sein, when he met some UN representatives and he proposed his solution to the problem. What was his solution? His solution was that all these refugees, these Rohingya Muslims, should be gathered in refugee camps and expelled from the country. Because they're not Burmese, they're not from Myanmar. He had the audacity to suggest this as a solution. Allahu Akbar. And this should show you the extremity to which this situation has come. He said, and I quote, "It is not possible to accept Rohingya who entered the country illegally and they are not from our race." And for him, it's just a question of national security. Subhanallah, these defenseless people, they have no weapons. They are defenseless, innocent men, women and children, and they become a national security question for states. They're a small minority, and they become a question of national security, not only for Burma, but for Bangladesh and for the rest of the world. These are the facts which we know. But today we want to go a little bit deeper to raise really awareness on this issue, to find out, because we know about other countries, we know about Syria and the Arab countries and Pakistan and other areas, Afghanistan, where issues have occurred. But this is a country, subhanAllah, many Muslims did not even know that Muslims exist in Burma. They don't know the history, they don't know the reality on the ground. So in my presentation, I want to go beyond the surface to look at some of these facts and some of this history, and to understand the problem and to understand the politics behind the problem. And then inshallah, our Anas will have a look at some of the issues from the angle of solutions and thinking about what can be done. In terms of some of the facts on the ground, some of the demography, the Rohingya Muslims live in the western part of Burma. As you can see on the map here, this is a map of Burma. And if you go right to the west, in what is now known as the Rakhine State, what was previously known as Arakan, and we'll talk about these name changes as well. On the west, that very small, narrow strip that joins the Bay of Bengal. This is where the major issues are occurring. This is where the Rohingya Muslims, the majority of them, are populated. This map also shows you Burma and its surrounding areas. It shares a border with India, it shares a border with Bangladesh, with China, with Laos and Thailand. And of course, where the main issue occurs, it touches the Bay of Bengal, which then moves into the Indian Ocean. The Rohingya people are descendants of Arab Muslims, Muslims from Arabia who came there long time ago, as we'll discuss, and at the same time descendants of the natives of that region that existed at the time. So obviously when the Muslims would come, when the Muslim armies would come and the Muslims would come and from the Khilafah state, they would settle, people would convert, they would get married with the natives, and that's what we've seen many of these populations around the world. The Rohingya are one type of this population in this part of the world. And this history is important because part of the conflict is ideological, where they are trying to change the history. As the president was saying, he's saying they're not part of our race. These people are not part of our race, they don't belong here. And some Burmese historians are making ridiculous claims such as, this whole idea of Rohingya is only 50, 60, 70 years old. It's been made up, it's a political thing. So it's important for us to know our history. In terms of the population, Burma has a population of about 60 million, out of which about 20% are Muslims, even though the official figures only recognize 4%. But 20% of people in Myanmar are Muslims. 70% are Buddhist, and the remaining 10% are Hindu, Christian and other religions. And in terms of the Rohingya, which is an ethnicity, about 1.5 million live inside Burma, and a similar number, that's how large, live outside because they've been forced. So they live outside. There's about 300,000 in Bangladesh, out of which only about 30,000 are recognized refugees. The rest, over 200,000, are what you saw in the report, unregistered refugees. That means they don't really exist. They're not really refugees, but they happen to be there. And then there's also some of these in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, and other countries where they've been pushed out to live. What about the history of this region? Islam came to this region in the 8th century. In about 788 of the Common Era, at the time of the Khilafah of Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Khilafah, Muslims came here as individuals, and Islam was spread along that region, the Arakan province region, mainly by seaborne Muslims, seaborne Sufis and other Muslims and merchants, traders, who in the individual capacity would come here and they would interact and live there, and Islam spread through this way. By about the 15th century, however, for a good 3 centuries, Muslims were ruling this province as well, the Arakan province. They were ruling this, and you can see why, because the neighboring regions are regions which Muslims have ruled for many centuries. The Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh, India, in Pakistan and Sindh, where the armies actually came from. They've ruled this area. But the Arakan province itself, from 1430 to 1784, was ruled by Muslims. In 1784, the kuffar of the region, the Buddhists and others, they united against the Muslims of this province. They invaded, they occupied the land. A lot of killing and looting and displacement took place, and they took over. Following this, obviously, we know of the colonial era, the British Empire, which had long established a colony in India, but they also had a colony in Burma. Burma was also a British colony. And similarly, this region, the Arakan region, was under British rule. Later on, obviously with most of the other regions in the early 20th century, after World War I, when we saw this period of independence, first the Burmese colony was separated from the Indian colony and made separate, and it was ruled by Buddhists, by regimes, by people who were Buddhists, but obviously behind them was the British colony. In World War II, Burma became a front of British and Japanese conflict, with Japan on one side, and there were many Burmese who were trained in Japan and sent back to fight what was for them a war of independence. And again, even in this, the Muslims, the Rohingya people, were the collateral. In 1948, finally, Burma was granted independence from Britain. But like all the other independence that took place in this region and in other parts of the Muslim and the so-called Third World, this was obviously a independence in name. In reality, Britain still held the largest degree of influence and power in this country. They just gave power to people from the region to rule. In 1962, so from 1948 to about 1962, we have a civilian government that still is influenced and controlled from behind by the British. In 1962, a military coup took place. A military coup took place under the leadership of the military general Ne Win. And he then ruled for a few decades. Still Britain is behind them. And he ruled in the name of what was known as the State Council for Restoring Law and Order. As in these regions, as most of the military coups take place, they're done in the name of emergency law. They're done in the name of coming to save the situation from, a failed state's going to occur if they don't come in. So they've come in and they've taken power. However, of course, there was pressure, particularly from America and other countries, that we can't have this military rule. There has to be elections, and civilian rule has to take place. And so elections did take place, and we'll talk a little bit about this struggle between the colonial powers. But elections took place in 1990, the opposition won a lot of the votes, and the Rohingya Muslims voted for the opposition. You can imagine why. They've been oppressed for so long, they're looking for an alternative. But the opposition won, the military didn't accept it, came in, took him out of office, took him out of power, didn't accept the transfer of power, and again the Muslims were again oppressed. Why? Why did you vote for the opposition? SubhanAllah, anything they did was used as a means to further the oppression. In 1989 also, this name issue, Myanmar, Burma, which you may have seen, in 1989 this name change took place, where the military council changed the name from Burma, which was the traditional name, to Myanmar. And this was for political reasons. It was not, they don't have different meanings too much in the local languages, but it was for political reasons, and this is why we see that some countries still insist on using Burma, whilst other countries are happy to use Myanmar. But they both mean the same thing. So what we have currently in Myanmar is a military junta, which just means that military leaders are ruling the country, who have an iron fist rule, and who actually oppress many of the ethnic minorities, part of which we find are the Muslims. They regularly detain people, they torture people, they extrajudicially kill people in order to maintain that grip. And again, this is not something that is different from what occurs in many other parts of the Muslim world and in other parts of the world as well. They consider the Rohingya Muslims as foreigners, as we've seen. They're foreigners, they're not part of the country. They're not given nationality. They don't have recognized rights. They are pushed to either be expelled or they are harshly treated. And even when we hear that, for example, that the Buddhists are attacking, this is with the support of the government, this is with the support of the military regime, who either explicitly and directly assist or who turn a blind eye and allow them to do this, because as I said, it's part of their policy, that these people are not part of Burma. They need to be kicked out. So even if they remain, the policies that are adopted are those which will push them to leave. But since no other country will accept them, it's not going to succeed. And the people most worstly affected are the Muslims, or the Rohingya themselves. Because Burma won't accept them, they put policies to push them out, but when they get pushed out, no one accepts them. Except a few countries who are pushed by the UN to take a little bit here and take a little bit there, but the vast majority are either displaced refugees, unregistered, or are severely oppressed still inside Myanmar. And the types of abuses that they face are many. Things like being prohibited to marry, needing a license to marry, not being allowed to marry until you reach the age of 30. These are means to control the population growth, to make sure that they don't grow, and to try and finish them off. Torture, rape, forced slavery on roads and in camps. SubhanAllah, even to the extent where you'll find Rohingya villages where the military junta or the government wants to kick them out and bring Buddhists in their place. So what they will do, they will use these Muslims to build these villages. They'll tell them, move out, build the village, and they'll use the excuse that we want to make a model village here. We want to upgrade the village. So they'll use them to build the village, then kick them out and bring the Buddhists in. Imagine that. Imagine being in a situation like that. And what does the building mean? Building is not just normal construction. Sometimes it's mosques. You have to change the mosque into a temple. You have to change this Islamic architecture into Buddhist architecture. You have to do it with your own hands, and then you have to leave. This is the situation that they face. So they're denied citizenship, land is confiscated, they're forced to be evicted, there's extrajudicial killings, they need permission to travel. Even to travel within Burma, they need permission. If you're found outside the Rakhine State, you don't have permission, you go to jail. Even if you do have permission and the police officer feels like putting you in jail, you go to jail. Recently there was a case of a group of Muslims who were travelling with a permit. They had the permit to travel, but still sent to jail for 7 or 8 years for travelling. Oppressive taxation. Taxes on everything. If you want to get married, you have to pay a tax. A tax on collecting firewood and bamboo. A tax to register deaths and births. A tax on livestock. And everything that they can put a tax on, there's a tax on it. And these are people who don't have money in the first place. Islamic leaders and imams are harassed. Sometimes they're forced to shave their beards, to change their dress. And they're forced to issue un-Islamic rulings and the like. Similarly, those of these Rohingya Muslims who are forced to leave and go to places like Bangladesh are not, as we saw in the video. They live in camps. They're viewed with hatred by some of the local population. They're tortured by the police. They're beaten. Their things are snatched away, and they're just considered as they're not really here, but they're here. And we have to deal with them when they're a problem. Some examples of the more sustained acts of oppression and massacres. In 1942, the Muslims were exposed in this region to harsh massacres at the hand of Buddhists during the period of World War I and World War II, when the Japanese were coming in and there was a lot of conflict. 1,000 Muslims were killed and hundreds of thousands were forced to leave the country. In 1978, again, more than 500,000 Muslims were expelled from the country. More than 40,000 of them, because of this, died because of the harsh conditions. Elderly people, women, children, being forced to leave and go. In 1988, again, more than 150,000 Muslims were pushed to migrate abroad. And more than 500,000 were subjected to migration and expulsion from the country in retaliation for what? For the fact that they voted for the opposition party. When the elections occurred in the early 90s, in the late 80s and the 90s, and the Muslims, naturally, you've been suppressed by the current regime, so when there's an election, you're going to vote for the opposition, whoever the opposition is. They voted, and obviously the military came back in, took them out of office, and now they've punished the Muslims for voting for the opposition. In 1997, over 40 mosques were destroyed by the military, which is these are some of the examples to show that this is not new. It's not a new issue. It's just come to our attention. It's something that's been happening for a long time. They also have a policy, as I mentioned earlier, of wiping out the Islamic heritage, changing mosques, destroying Islamic architecture, changing the history, changing names. If you notice the map that I showed you, the province is known as, and was historically known as the Rakhine province. Now it's called the Rakhine State, which is more a Buddhist terminology. And the capital of the Rakhine State was Akyab, which has, you can even notice that it's got roots in the Arabic language and other Islamic heritage, and now it's known as Sitwi. Name change, they're changing names, they're changing everything to try and wipe out the history and show that nothing ever existed here. A little bit about the politics. It's important to understand what's behind this. We shouldn't just be reactionary. We shouldn't go, Allah, people are dying, let's send some charity. People are dying, let's do something quickly. We have to understand what's happening behind. And Abu Anas will talk about the solution, but what is the politics behind all of this? You'll find Burma is not a different case to what is happening in many other third world countries, where the real clash is not between the government and the people. That's the symptom of the problem. The real clash is between colonial powers, who before had direct control and after independence have maintained indirect control. So in Burma, the British have had control when they were there as colonizers. But even when they gave independence, they maintained dominance, they maintained their influence through people, through agents, through institutions, through organizations, and the like. So what has happened is that the British have maintained this control. Even now, the British support, covertly they support the military rule. They support this government. Now, on the other side, as is usual in a colonial struggle, America seeks to, as the superpower of the time, seeks to challenge this for her own benefit, for her own economic and political benefit. And this is why we've seen this opposition movement led by Aung San Suu Kyi, who America has pushed. They've pushed public opinion, and they do so in the name of freedom and civilian rule and being against dictatorship and so on and so forth. But the reality on the ground shows us that that's not what their concern is. Their concern is their own dominance and their own influence. But this is what we've seen. So on the one hand, we've got the military junta backed by Britain. On the other hand, we've got America, which is pushing the opposition and trying to get a headway into the country. So when we saw the elections which took place, so the military ruled for a long time, from 62 all the way to the early 90s. Then when they were pushed to do elections, what Britain and India is also part of the equation on the British side. They were pushed to do elections. So what did they do? What they did was they said, okay, we'll have elections. But in the elections, they made a party from the military of retired generals. They stood as the party and they were made to have most of the votes. They won 80% of the votes in the most recent elections. In the previous election, which were different, when the opposition actually won, the military just came in and took them out. In the recent elections, they put their own party in, and this is what they've done. So the president, Thein Sein, he's a retired general, and this civilian government is retired generals. It's just the military now ruling by proxy instead of ruling directly. So through this means, Britain has been able to maintain its influence and control. But of course, America is pushing. And so we see Aung San Suu Kyi traveling around the world and making a case for the opposition and pressure being put on the government. We have to understand all of this. And you need to look at the big picture to understand what's going on. It's not one lady who has power to challenge the military. She can't do anything. Right? She has people, she has countries behind her for their own benefit, for their own politics. And when we want to understand what we can do, we have to understand what is actually going on the ground. Finally, the current attacks themselves. These current attacks, they began in June, as I said, and they were triggered when a group of Muslims, 9 or 10 Muslim men on a bus were killed. They were killed in cold blood, allegedly as a reprisal for a Burmese woman who was raped. So some woman was raped, the Muslims were accused, and 10 Muslims were killed because of this, and this triggered the violence. So Muslims came out and protested because 10 people were killed. The military came in claiming that they're going to quell the violence, but they started attacking the Muslims. More Muslims were killed, and then now with the majority people have had an excuse to push and start the violence, which we saw. So villages were attacked, people were forced to leave, and large numbers were evacuated, and lots of people were killed. And the violence continues. Finally, just to show you the one point of the hypocrisy, when this current violence that's taken place, the US Embassy in Burma issued a statement after its representatives visited some of the Muslim regions in some of the areas and saw what was happening. They issued a statement and they said, quote, "The most important thing now is that all parties should remain calm." Allahu Akbar. That all parties should remain calm and that there is a need for more dialogue, which can occur only when there is calm. And he said the embassy encourages the government of Myanmar to investigate the incidents in such a way that it respects the legal process and the rule of law. Yani, stay calm. Muslims are being killed, people are being killed, they're being chucked out in their hundreds of thousands. Remain calm and have dialogue. Allahu Akbar. And you see the difference when two different things. When America is attacked and 3,000 people die, they don't remain calm. And when September 11th happened, they don't remain calm. They want to turn the whole world upside down. Why? Because Americans got killed. Why didn't they stay calm and have dialogue? Why did they send their armies to take revenge? But when someone else is killed, when the Muslims are killed, stay calm, have dialogue. How can you have dialogue? People are being killed. Compare this also to when the Buddhist monks in 2007 were campaigning against the military regime. If you remember, in 2007, the Buddhists were coming out, there were big marches, and America stood up and said, this is important, we have to do this, brought attention, imposed sanctions. It imposed sanctions on the regime in Burma, and it was a big issue. But now they want us to remain calm because it's Muslims. So again, it's important to understand what's happening, to understand some of the details, to be aware of some of our history. This is our history. This is not the history of the Burmese people or the Rohingya Muslims. The Muslim Ummah is one nation. So their history is our history and our history is their history. We should understand this. We should be aware of what is happening, of what is the history in this region, what is befalling these Muslims, and what is actually going on the ground in terms of the politics and the reality of the clashes. فأقول ما تسمعون واستغفر الله ولكم فإنه هو الغفور الرحيم.